The school bell rang, signaling the beginning of another typical day at Meadowbrook Academy. The hallways buzzed with the chatter of 5-year-olds in colorful backpacks, and the smell of freshly sharpened pencils filled the air. But in room 12, something wasn't quite right. It was a sunny Tuesday morning, and Ms. Alana Hayes, the kindergarten teacher with a reputation for being both liberal and progressive, stood at the front of the class, her eyes scanning the room for her usual group of eager students. She smiled warmly at them, making sure her tone was as engaging as possible. "Good morning, everyone," she said cheerfully, waiting for the chorus of sleepy but enthusiastic responses. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes," the class echoed. She clapped her hands together, ready to begin her first lesson of the day. "Who can tell me what color this is?" She held up a bright red apple, the vibrant fruit practically glowing under the fluorescent lights. One by one, the kids raised their hands, eager to contribute. But then, her eyes landed on the back of the room. There, in his usual spot, was Xii Musk. He sat quietly, eyes half closed, fingers tracing imaginary patterns on his desk. His name, an odd one, certainly, was enough to make any adult raise an eyebrow, but Ms. Hayes wasn't interested in the name. What struck her was the behavior. For some reason, X always seemed different. He was the son of tech mogul Elon Musk, a fact that his classmates and even a few teachers were quick to point out. But it wasn't his wealth or his eccentric parents that caught Ms. Hayes's attention. It was the air of aloofness he carried, the way he never quite interacted with the other children, the way he often seemed lost in his own world. "X." Ms. Hayes called sharply, her voice cutting through the light chatter. He looked up briefly, his large, thoughtful eyes meeting hers before he returned his gaze to his desk. "Are you with us today?" she asked, a hint of annoyance in her tone. "Can you tell me what color this is?" For a brief moment, X didn't respond. He didn't look nervous, or even embarrassed. He simply stared at the apple for a long while. Ms. Hayes waited, expecting a raised hand, a quick answer. But instead, X just leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. Ms. Hayes felt a rush of frustration rise in her chest. It wasn't the first time he'd ignored her, but today was different. She couldn't afford to let him slip through the cracks in front of the class. After all, she prided herself on being the teacher who could engage every student, no matter how quirky or difficult they were. "X, I know you're capable of answering simple questions," she said, trying to keep the irritation out of her voice. "We've talked about this before." "It's red." But X remained silent, his eyes distant. He seemed completely unconcerned with the attention on him. Ms. Hayes shook her head and tried to move on, but the other kids in the class were starting to whisper. "Why does he always ignore Ms. Hayes?" a child behind X asked in a loud whisper. "Is he rude?" X didn't flinch. He didn't care. He simply looked out the window, lost in thought. He had always been different, but today, something inside him felt strange. He was thinking, calculating in his own quiet way. The simple apple question had triggered something inside him, but he wasn't going to show it. From his seat, X couldn't understand why they were wasting time talking about colors when there was so much more to explore. Why didn't anyone talk about the way numbers could dance together, or how equations could solve problems that people never even thought to ask? But no one in the class cared about that. They were 5 years old. And Ms. Hayes, with all her progressive ideals, couldn't possibly understand the world through his lens. "X, I want you to answer now," Ms. Hayes said, raising her voice just enough to command the room's attention. "Why can't you ever follow along with the lesson? Everyone else is participating." She meant it as a gentle push, but it came off as a challenge. The students were watching, waiting for X to respond in some way, but he remained still, almost stoic. The tension in the room grew thicker by the second. His classmates started to giggle quietly, unsure whether to mock him or feel sorry for him. A few even exchanged glances, wondering what was wrong with him. They didn't know what it was about X that made him so different, but they knew he was not like them. Ms. Hayes sighed. It was clear to her now that X wasn't just a quiet kid. He was, in her eyes, a problem. A kid who didn't fit into the mold. And it frustrated her. X, if you can't participate like the others, she continued, forcing a tight smile, maybe you should sit out for today's lesson. We need to make sure everyone's involved. The class went silent. Xii Musk didn't flinch, didn't react. He simply sat there, silently processing everything. The simple question about the color of the apple wasn't what bothered him. No, it was the fact that Ms. Hayes didn't see what was truly important about the world around them. The tension in the air was thick as Ms. Hayes moved on, trying to cover up her frustration by continuing the lesson. But her attempt to force X out of the spotlight only planted the first seed of doubt. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Xii Musk wasn't just a regular 5-year-old. His mind was a labyrinth of calculations and ideas beyond anyone's understanding. While the other children focused on counting in basic shapes, X's brain was solving problems most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. But that was a secret he would keep hidden, for now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Xii Musk had never been a typical child. From the moment he was born, his life had been anything but ordinary. Raised by two of the most eccentric and brilliant figures on the planet, his father, Elon Musk, the tech mogul behind companies like Tesla and SpaceX, and his mother, Grimes, renowned musician known for her avant-garde style, X's world was filled with a whirlwind of ideas, innovations, and endless possibilities. But as a 5-year-old, X didn't yet understand the grandiosity of his name. To him, the oddness of his name, an amalgamation of letters and numbers, was just a part of life. It was a bit like his world, complicated, unusual, and always a little out of sync with the world around him. While his peers struggled with basic words and concepts, X's mind was already building complex systems of thought. He was a child born into a world of technology, but he was also a child still finding his way. Elon Musk, while immersed in his work, always made time for his son. Their relationship was a quiet one, full of unspoken understanding. X didn't need to be told that his father was a genius, he saw it in the way his father approached every problem, as though each challenge was merely a puzzle to be solved. Yet, Elon never pushed X to follow in his footsteps. In fact, he often encouraged him to explore his own path, though X's curiosity often led him down the same complex roads his father navigated daily. Grimes, on the other hand, was an artist, and she made sure that X had a balance of creativity in his life. She taught him how to draw, how to listen to music with an open heart, and how to see beauty in the world. She wasn't as concerned with whether X became the next tech prodigy like his father, but she did hope that he would grow into someone who appreciated the wonders of the world, both scientific and artistic. But despite the love and nurturing of both his parents, X always felt like an outsider. His mind worked differently than other kids. While they were learning to count and read, X would get lost in his thoughts, counting the patterns in the clouds or calculating how many seconds it would take for a rocket to reach Mars. When his parents realized that X had an extraordinary aptitude for numbers, they were initially shocked but quickly decided to let him explore his abilities on his own terms. It wasn't that they didn't want to push him, it was that they knew pushing would only take away the joy and wonder that came with discovery. In school, things were more complicated. X was enrolled at Meadowbrook Academy, a progressive school that promised to cultivate children's unique abilities. However, from the moment he stepped into room 12, he felt out of place. The other kids in his class were more interested in toys, games, and stories than solving equations or contemplating the mysteries of the universe. X's teacher, Ms. Hayes, was a well-meaning but somewhat narrow-minded educator. She had great ideas about what children should learn and how they should behave, but she had one major flaw: she couldn't see beyond the surface. Ms. Hayes believed that every child had to follow the same path, learn the same things at the same time. She wasn't ready for a student like X, one who didn't fit neatly into any educational mold. But X had always been comfortable with being different. He didn't see it as something negative. He had his own way of processing the world, and while the other kids in his class struggled with simple concepts, X had already mastered them and moved on to more complex ones. His brain worked like a finely tuned machine, making connections between ideas faster than anyone could comprehend. And yet, he never showed off or acted out. He simply existed in his own quiet, intelligent way, just observing and thinking. The way X saw it, school was simply a place where he could play with ideas, even if those ideas didn't always fit the lessons Ms. Hayes was teaching. When X wasn't solving advanced math problems in his head, he would draw intricate pictures of space, of numbers spiraling out into infinity, or of algorithms that no one else could understand. His artistic side, influenced by his mother, often took the form of abstract representations of math, things that others might see as chaotic, but to him, were beautifully structured. At home, X would sit with his father late into the evening, watching rocket launches on TV or discussing the future of artificial intelligence. Elon would sometimes ask X what he thought about the problems he was solving, though it was clear that his son's mind worked in ways that were beyond even his grasp. They would talk about technology, about the stars, about the world's biggest challenges, and X would listen, absorbing everything in his own quiet way. But despite all this, X had a quiet longing. He wanted to be seen for who he was. He wanted someone, just one person, who could understand his mind. Someone who wouldn't look at him as a quiet, weird kid who didn't speak up enough or wasn't normal enough. But X had no idea that the one person who would truly understand him might just be the last person he expected, his teacher, Ms. Hayes. There was a part of him that knew he had to reveal his true self eventually, but he wasn't sure when. His parents had always protected him, allowing him to explore his thoughts and ideas freely without the pressure to conform. But school was a different beast. School, with its structure and expectations, often felt stifling. And Ms. Hayes, in her attempt to mold him into something he wasn't making it easier. And yet, even as his teacher misunderstood him, X was unaware that his time to shine was fast approaching. What Ms. Hayes didn't know, what none of the kids in his class knew, was that Xii Musk was not like other 5-year-olds. His mind was already way ahead of them all, and he had only just begun to realize it. The next few days in room 12 were filled with an unease that lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Ms. Hayes was clearly irritated by X's lack of participation, and though she tried to mask her frustration with kindness, her efforts felt hollow. For X, it was business as usual. He sat quietly, looking out the window or scribbling complex equations in the margins of his notebook. He didn't really care about the daily routine of the class. But what X didn't anticipate was how far Ms. Hayes was willing to go to push him to conform. It started with small things, a comment here, a nudge there. X, she said one morning after the reading time was over, could you please join us for the group activity? It's important that you engage with the class. X didn't respond. He wasn't being rude, he simply wasn't interested. He had long since figured out that group activities weren't for him. The other kids weren't asking the questions he wanted to answer. They weren't thinking the way he was thinking. X. Ms. Hayes called again, this time her voice sharper. The other kids turned to look, the tension in the room rising. He slowly turned his head toward her. His expression was unreadable, a quiet mix of indifference and curiosity. But in Ms. Hayes's eyes, this was the final straw. I'm going to have to ask you to participate, X, she said firmly. You can't just sit there all day doing your own thing. You're part of this class, and you need to engage. X blinked, the words bouncing off him as if they had no weight. He wasn't trying to upset Ms. Hayes, he just didn't understand the point of what she was asking. Why should he color inside the lines when there were infinite patterns to be discovered outside them? Ms. Hayes didn't give up. "I've seen you doodling in your notebook every day. You need to focus on the lesson, not on whatever that is. You're not going to get anywhere if you keep tuning out like this." Her words stung more than X expected. It wasn't the criticism that bothered him, but the sheer misunderstanding of who he was. Did she really think he was tuning out? Did she truly believe he was just drawing random shapes instead of exploring something far more intricate? The other kids, sensing the tension, began to whisper. Some giggled, while others exchanged knowing glances. To them, X was just the quiet kid, the one who didn't fit in. They didn't understand him either, and for some reason, they saw his quietude as a weakness, something to be mocked or ignored. Ms. Hayes, on the other hand, didn't see it as weakness. She saw it as a challenge, one she was determined to solve. Later that afternoon, Ms. Hayes decided to take matters into her own hands. She called X up to her desk after the class had been dismissed for recess. She had a plan. "X," she began, her tone now softer but still authoritative. "We need to have a serious conversation. I think it's time we have a little test, something to see where you're at with the work." X raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. "I've noticed you've been drawing in class, not participating in group activities. I think it's important that you demonstrate what you've learned so far. Are you ready for a little challenge?" Ms. Hayes asked. X tilted his head, looking at her. He had no idea what she meant by challenge, but he was intrigued. It wasn't that he didn't want to engage. It was that the things they were learning didn't interest him. The question seemed too easy, too trivial. But if this was something new, something different, maybe he would give it a try. "Sure," he said, his voice quiet but calm. Ms. Hayes reached into her drawer and pulled out a small worksheet, one that she had prepared just for X. It was a mix of basic arithmetic problems, addition and subtraction, and a few simple word problems. To any other child in the class, it would have been a standard exercise, a way to reinforce the lessons of the day. She slid the worksheet in front of X, giving him a smile that was both kind and expectant. "Here you go. Let's see how you do." X didn't immediately pick up the pencil. Instead, he looked at the problems with a slight frown. It wasn't that the problems were difficult for him. On the contrary, they were far too easy. He could do them in his head faster than Ms. Hayes could blink. But he didn't want to show off. He didn't want to make her feel bad for setting up such a simple test. But the challenge was too tempting. X picked up the pencil slowly and started working through the problems with an unusual focus. He solved the first few problems in his head, his fingers moving quickly over the paper as he wrote down the answers. By the time he got to the word problems, he was beginning to grow bored, but he didn't stop. He wanted to see if Ms. Hayes would notice. In less than 5 minutes, X had completed the worksheet, and with a slight sigh, he placed it back on Ms. Hayes's desk. She was staring at the paper, wide-eyed. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked it up, scanning the answers one by one. Every single one was correct, of course. But there was something else. The way X had approached the word problems was different. He hadn't just solved them, he had come up with a more complex method of solving them. The answers were right, but the path he had taken was nothing short of genius. Ms. Hayes stared at the paper, unsure of how to react. The child she had written off as disengaged had just proven to be leagues ahead of everyone else in the class. But she couldn't just admit she was wrong. She couldn't show weakness in front of the class. As she sat there, trying to comprehend what she had just seen, X stood up, ready to leave. "Are you done?" she asked, still in shock. "Yes," X replied, his voice even. "Can I go to recess now?" Ms. Hayes didn't know what to say. She nodded absent-mindedly, and X walked back to his seat, a quiet smile on his face. It wasn't arrogance, not at all. It was just the peace that came from knowing he was capable of so much more than anyone realized. As the bell rang for recess, X walked out of the classroom with a sense of calm. He wasn't trying to make anyone feel inferior, he just wanted to be understood. Ms. Hayes, meanwhile, stood frozen, staring at the worksheet in disbelief. What had just happened? She had been so focused on pushing him to participate that she had missed the fact that he wasn't just a quiet child, he was a prodigy, a genius in disguise. And now, she had no idea what to do with this new information. The following days were a mixture of tension and curiosity. Xii Musk had no idea how his simple act of completing the worksheet so quickly had set off a chain of events that would change everything. For him, it was just another exercise in problem solving, something he had been doing since before he could walk. But for Ms. Hayes, it was a revelation, one that left her both impressed and unsure of how to handle what she had just discovered. The day after the worksheet incident, Ms. Hayes could hardly focus during class. Her mind kept returning to the answer sheet X had submitted. How had he solved the problem so quickly? More importantly, how had he found a way to approach the problems that no one else would have thought of? The kid was a puzzle. And Ms. Hayes, though she hated to admit it, was stumped. The following week, she decided to test him further. This time, she didn't offer a simple worksheet. Instead, she crafted an elaborate challenge that required a bit of creativity, logical thinking, and problem solving. She wanted to see if X's quick and seemingly effortless abilities were a fluke or if there was something deeper at play. As the class settled into their seats, Ms. Hayes handed out the new assignment. It was a multi-step math problem, designed to test both arithmetic skills and abstract thinking. She watched as the other kids glanced at it nervously. They were still in the early stages of learning basic addition and subtraction, so the complexity of the problem would be a challenge for most. When X's eyes landed on the problem, his lips twitched in amusement. He didn't need to read the question more than once. He understood it immediately, and his mind was already calculating the most efficient solution. While the other students hesitated, nervously picking up their pencils, X didn't waste time. He leaned over his paper and started scribbling furiously, the ideas flowing through his mind like a fast-moving river. He completed the first step in a matter of seconds, then quickly moved on to the next. Ms. Hayes, keeping a careful eye on him from her desk, was both fascinated and frustrated. How was this child so far ahead of the others? The other students were struggling with the initial steps, while X was already deep into the most complex part of the problem. 5 minutes passed, and X was the first to finish. He stood up, walked over to Ms. Hayes's desk, and quietly placed his completed worksheet in front of her. "Finished," he said simply. Ms. Hayes picked up the paper, her hand shaking slightly. She glanced at the answer, then scanned the steps. She saw the first few answers, correct, of course, but what truly caught her attention were the methods X had used to reach those answers. It was nothing like what they had been taught. It was, in fact, a combination of different techniques that she had never even considered. The problem-solving strategies X had implemented were not only efficient, they were revolutionary. She couldn't believe what she was looking at. She was about to teach a class of 5-year-olds, and one of them had just demonstrated a level of understanding that most adults could never grasp. As Ms. Hayes sat at her desk, stunned by what she was seeing, X stood in front of her, waiting patiently. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, just a quiet assurance that this was something he could do, something he had always been able to do. "Ms. Hayes," he said, breaking the silence. "Is there something wrong with my answers?" For the first time in a long while, Ms. Hayes was speechless. She wasn't sure how to respond. She wasn't even sure what she was supposed to do with this new information. She had been teaching for years, and yet she had never encountered a child like X. "Well," Ms. Hayes finally began, her voice betraying a mix of awe and confusion, "you're not like the other kids, are you?" X didn't respond. Instead, he simply looked at her with his usual steady gaze. He didn't need to say anything. He knew what she meant. He wasn't like the others, and he didn't want to be. His mind worked differently, and though he understood that this made him an outsider, he didn't mind. Ms. Hayes took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. "I'll need to think about this," she said slowly, more to herself than to X. She picked up the worksheet again, rereading the answers and methods, still trying to process what she was seeing. X turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused. "Am I done?" he asked quietly. Ms. Hayes looked up at him, her mind racing. She couldn't just let him walk away like this, not without understanding more about what had just happened. She wasn't sure if she was ready to confront the implications of his abilities, but she knew that this wasn't something she could ignore. "X, wait," she called after him. He stopped, turning back to her with that same calm, unreadable expression. She hesitated for a moment, wondering how to phrase the next question. She needed to know how far this genius mind of his went. But more than that, she needed to understand X himself. She wasn't sure what kind of support he needed, but she knew he needed something different from the rest of the class. "What do you want to learn about?" she asked, her voice softer now, more genuine than before. X's eyes brightened slightly. "Everything," he answered simply, and with that, he walked out of the classroom. Ms. Hayes watched him leave, the weight of her new realization settling on her shoulders. She wasn't sure how she would approach the situation, but one thing was certain: X was no ordinary child, and her role as his teacher was about to become far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The days following the math test were a whirlwind. Ms. Hayes was caught between awe and confusion. She couldn't get over how advanced X's thinking was. Her initial instincts had been to push him to conform to the class's pace, to force him into a mold. But that wasn't the solution, was it? In fact, trying to make X fit in with everyone else now felt wrong, almost cruel. But what was the right thing to do? She couldn't shake the thought that maybe X didn't just need a different teaching approach, maybe he needed someone who could truly understand him. It was on a rainy Wednesday that Ms. Hayes finally decided to act. She had spent the previous night researching gifted children and how to support them, but she realized something important as she sat at her desk early that morning. X wasn't just gifted, he was something entirely different. She needed to learn more about him. She needed to help him find his place in a world that wasn't built for kids like him. The bell rang, and the classroom buzzed with the usual chatter as the students filed in for another day of lessons. X walked in, as always, with his quiet confidence. But something was different today. There was a weight in the air, something she couldn't quite place. She had already planned to speak to him privately after class, to ask him about his life, his interests, what made him tick. But there was more to it now. The realization that X wasn't just a quiet child had completely transformed the way she saw him. The lesson for the day was on basic word problems, something Ms. Hayes knew would likely bore X. She had a feeling he wouldn't even be interested in answering them. So, instead of setting up the usual lesson plan, she decided to break from routine. She stood in front of the class and addressed them in a way she never had before. "Class," she began, her voice soft but firm, "today we're going to try something a little different. I want to start by asking all of you a question. What is the hardest thing you've ever had to solve? And what did you learn from that?" The students looked at her, puzzled, unsure of what to make of this new direction. X, however, was already thinking. His eyes didn't leave her as she spoke, his mind working rapidly behind that calm exterior. Ms. Hayes could feel the shift in energy in the room. For the first time, she realized she wasn't teaching a lesson, she was opening the door for something far deeper. One by one, the students began sharing their answers, some trivial, some profound. But X stayed silent, observing the others. She wasn't surprised. She knew that whatever challenge had shaped his life, it wasn't something that could be understood by the average 5-year-old. But what did he think was hard? What did he struggle with? When it was X's turn, he surprised her. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "the hardest thing I've ever had to solve, is knowing how to fit in. Ms. Hayes blinked. She had expected a statement about a complicated math problem, not this. But in that moment, she saw it, truly saw it. X wasn't just a child who excelled at math. He was a child who had been forced to navigate a world that wasn't built for his mind, a world that didn't understand how his genius worked. She felt her heart sink. It wasn't just about math for X. It was about the emotional weight of being different, of constantly feeling isolated, of knowing that everyone else around him was struggling with things he could solve in seconds, yet they still didn't understand him. How could he ever feel like he belonged? Ms. Hayes didn't know how to respond immediately. She knew her next words had to be the right ones. She couldn't simply dismiss X's statement or try to brush it off with a platitude. This was the emotional climax of their story. Everything that had been building up in both of them was now being laid bare. After a long pause, Ms. Hayes finally spoke, her voice soft and genuine. X, I understand now. You don't need to fit in with the others, not if it means giving up who you are. You don't have to be like everyone else. But we do need to find a way for you to be part of this world, to feel understood. X looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He wasn't sure what to make of this yet, but there was a flicker of something, hope, maybe, dancing in his gaze. You don't want me to fit in? He asked, his voice filled with a quiet vulnerability. No, Ms. Hayes replied firmly. I want you to be yourself. I just need to help you find a way to make that work here. To help you see that you don't have to hide what makes you special, but we also need to find a way to make this work for everyone. X nodded, though he wasn't fully convinced. He had heard similar things before, but it never quite felt like it came from a place of true understanding. He wasn't sure if Ms. Hayes could really help him. But for the first time, there was a sense that maybe she wanted to try. And that, in itself, was a powerful thing. As the class went on, X stayed engaged in ways he hadn't before. Ms. Hayes noticed small changes in him. He seemed a little more open, a little less distant. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was something. She realized that today marked a turning point for both of them. No longer would she just try to make him conform. She would try to understand him, to see the world through his eyes. And in that moment, something changed in X too. He wasn't quite sure what, but he felt lighter. He had never been asked to simply be himself before, especially not by an adult. There was something in the way Ms. Hayes had spoken to him, a genuine desire to help him, to make him feel seen, understood, and accepted. For the first time in his young life, X felt like someone truly believed in him, not just for his brilliance, but for who he was as a person. Ms. Hayes had opened a door. But now, they would both have to walk through it. The rest of the week passed by in a blur for Ms. Hayes. The conversation with X had left her with a sense of urgency and purpose she hadn't felt before. She had always prided herself on being a good teacher, someone who could meet her students where they were, but X had challenged everything she thought she knew. He wasn't just a child with an extraordinary gift, he was a child whose mind operated on a level that few could comprehend. And now, she realized that it was her job to help him navigate this world, to make space for him in ways that allowed him to thrive. But she also understood that this wasn't going to be easy. The other children in her class, though kind, were still learning the basics. They weren't prepared for the complexity of X's ideas. She couldn't just let him run ahead, that would isolate him even further. No, she had to find a balance. She had to integrate X's exceptional abilities without alienating him from his peers. The following Monday, Ms. Hayes made a decision. She would create an individualized learning plan for X, one that challenged him intellectually but also kept him grounded in his classwork. She was determined to find ways for him to work alongside the others, without overwhelming him or making him feel like an outsider. After school, she stayed late to plan. She crafted assignments and projects tailored to X's interests and skills, math puzzles that required higher-level reasoning, logic games that challenged his strategic thinking. But she also made sure that these assignments could be completed in parallel with the class's regular work. That way, X would still feel part of the group, but his mind wouldn't be stifled by the limits of traditional 5-year-old assignments. The next day, she introduced the new plan. The classroom buzzed as usual with the excited chatter of 5-year-olds, but Ms. Hayes had a quiet sense of purpose. She stood in front of the class, ready to make the announcement that would change everything for X. "All right, everyone," Ms. Hayes said, her voice calm but firm. "Today we're going to try something new. Some of you will continue working on the regular assignments, but X, I've created some special tasks for you that will really challenge your brain. I think you're ready for something different." X looked at her, his expression unreadable, but Ms. Hayes could see a flicker of interest in his eyes. He wasn't sure what to make of it yet, but he trusted her. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't being forced to fit into a mold. He was being given the freedom to explore the things that truly interested him. As the day went on, X dove into the assignments with a kind of intensity that startled even Ms. Hayes. He solved problems in record time, his mind racing through equations and puzzles as though they were second nature. But this time, instead of finishing early and wandering off, he stayed focused. He seemed to be savoring the challenge, savoring the feeling of finally being pushed in ways that made sense to him. Ms. Hayes couldn't help but smile as she watched him work. She had done it. She had found a way to integrate his brilliance without isolating him. For the first time, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not just as a teacher, but as someone who had helped a child finally find his place in the world. At the end of the day, as the other students filed out of the classroom, X lingered. He walked up to Ms. Hayes, holding out his completed assignments. "Ms. Hayes," he said, looking at her with a quiet sincerity, "this was fun." Ms. Hayes smiled warmly at him. "I'm glad you liked it, X. You did an amazing job." X's face softened, and for the first time, he seemed to truly relax. It was as though the weight he had been carrying, the weight of trying to fit in, of feeling like an outsider, had lifted just a little bit. In that moment, Ms. Hayes knew that they were on the right path. This was just the beginning. As X walked out the door, Ms. Hayes stood for a moment in the quiet of the empty classroom. She thought about everything that had happened over the past few weeks, the challenges, the misunderstandings, the breakthroughs. She realized that being a teacher wasn't just about passing on knowledge, it was about being flexible, about recognizing when a child needed something more, and about being willing to change in order to help them grow. X had taught her something she hadn't expected to learn, that every child, no matter how gifted or different, deserves to be seen for who they truly are. It wasn't just about academic success, it was about emotional growth, about feeling understood, and about being accepted for what made them unique. Ms. Hayes knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be challenges, and there would be times when she didn't know the right answer. But she was ready for it. She had seen X's potential, and now she was more determined than ever to help him unlock it. And as she stood there in the quiet of her classroom, she couldn't help but think of something X had said, "The hardest thing I've ever had to solve, is knowing how to fit in." But now, for the first time, X was starting to see that fitting in wasn't the answer. What mattered was that he stayed true to himself, that he learned to navigate the world in his own way, on his own terms. And Ms. Hayes would be right there, helping him every step of the way. The next few weeks in the classroom passed by quietly, but for X, everything felt different. He had been given the freedom to explore his intelligence in a way that had never happened before. He was still working with the other students, but Ms. Hayes had been finding ways to keep him engaged with his unique assignments, and it was clear that he was thriving. The classroom no longer felt like a place where he was just trying to fit in. Now, it felt like a place where he could truly be himself. But as comfortable as X had become with the new routine, there was still the looming question: how would he face the outside world? The world beyond his classroom, the one that didn't always understand children like him. He had spent so much time in the safety of Ms. Hayes' class, but now it was time to take that first step into the larger world. Ms. Hayes had noticed something new in X lately, a kind of quiet apprehension. It wasn't obvious at first. He was still his usual reserved self, solving puzzles and answering questions with precision. But there was an edge to his focus that had never been there before. It wasn't just about the assignments anymore. He was watching people, watching his classmates, as though he was sizing them up. One day, she pulled him aside after class. "X," she said gently, "I've noticed you've been a little quieter lately. Is everything okay?" X looked at her, his small face thoughtful. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, as if weighing his words carefully, he spoke. "I'm just wondering if I'll ever really be okay," he said, his voice almost a whisper. Ms. Hayes' heart clenched. She had expected X to struggle with the idea of fitting in, but hearing it spoken out loud brought a new level of reality to his feelings. "X," she said, kneeling down so that she was eye level with him. "You're more than okay. You're brilliant. But I think I understand what you mean. You're worried about the world beyond this classroom, aren't you? You're worried that people won't understand you." X nodded, a small frown crossing his face. "Everyone is always saying I'm different. But I don't want to be alone." Ms. Hayes sat next to him, her voice soft but firm. "You're not alone, X. Not here, and not anywhere. You're not the only one who feels like they don't fit in. The world is full of people who are different in their own ways. And the most important thing you can do is to stay true to yourself, no matter what." X's gaze flickered toward the door. The thought of the world outside seemed so vast, so unknown. It was easier to stay in the classroom, where he was understood. But Ms. Hayes was right. If he was going to continue growing, he had to step outside the safe space she had created for him. "Do you really think I can make it out there?" X asked quietly, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Ms. Hayes smiled, a soft but knowing smile. "I know you can. But it's okay to be scared. It's okay to feel unsure. You've already done something amazing, X. You've already started your journey. And I'll be here to support you, every step of the way." X didn't respond right away. He just sat there, deep in thought, but there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or at least the faintest spark of belief that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as different as he had once thought. Over the next few days, X took small steps. He began interacting more with his classmates, though still in his quiet way. He shared his thoughts with them, allowing himself to be a little more open. Some of the other kids were still baffled by his advanced knowledge, but others began to appreciate the way he thought. They began to see that he wasn't just a kid who could solve math problems faster than anyone else, he was a kid who had a unique perspective on the world. But the real challenge came when the school principal, Mrs. Taylor, announced an upcoming event, a school-wide talent show. "We're asking all the students to participate," she said in the morning announcements. "It doesn't matter what the talent is. You can sing, dance, show off your science experiments, or even do something with math. The sky's the limit." X froze when he heard the announcement. He wasn't one for public speaking, let alone performing in front of a crowd. And yet, the idea of being part of something larger, something where his talent could be recognized, sparked something inside him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this kind of challenge, but there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the opportunity. Ms. Hayes noticed his hesitation. "You're thinking about the talent show, aren't you?" she asked him after class that day. X nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can do it. What if people think I'm weird?" Ms. Hayes chuckled softly. "X, you've already done something incredible by sharing your ideas with your classmates. You're already inspiring them. Why not take it a step further? You don't have to perform like everyone else. You can show off your own talent, your math skills, or something that's uniquely you." X was quiet for a moment, considering her words. I could do something with math. Like a challenge? Ms. Hayes grinned. Exactly. You could give the other students a math challenge. Show them how exciting it can be. It's a great way for them to see your talent and maybe learn something new. X's face lit up. It was as though a door had opened in his mind. A math challenge. He could do that. And maybe, just maybe, he could show everyone that there was more to him than just being different. Maybe he could make math fun, something others could appreciate. The next few days were filled with excitement as X prepared his challenge. He created intricate math puzzles, games that challenged even the oldest students to think creatively. When the day of the talent show arrived, he was still nervous, but there was a new sense of determination in his heart. He wasn't going to hide anymore. He was going to show the world his talent, and show himself that he was more than capable. The talent show was a success. As X stood in front of the room, presenting his math challenge, he realized something. He wasn't just different. He was unique. And that uniqueness was something to be celebrated, not hidden. When the show ended, Ms. Hayes found X standing by the door, his face beaming with pride. "I did it," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You sure did," Ms. Hayes replied, her heart swelling with pride for the young boy who had taken such a brave step. And as X looked out over the crowd, he realized that fitting in wasn't about blending in with everyone else. It was about being true to who you are and finding the people who appreciate you for that. The days following the talent show brought a sense of calm, but also an undercurrent of excitement for X. The confidence he had gained from facing his fears and performing in front of the entire school wasn't something that faded quickly. In fact, it lingered with him, and he began to notice things he hadn't before. He was more willing to share his ideas, and he found himself enjoying his time with classmates more than he ever had. But, as with any major growth, there were still bumps in the road, especially when it came to his relationship with the other children. Although his math challenge had been a hit, X was still different. While the other kids acknowledged his skills, they didn't always know how to interact with him. Some were intrigued, others a little intimidated. There was one student in particular, Jamie, who always seemed to be at the center of the group. Jamie wasn't the smartest, nor the most athletic, but Jamie had something the others seemed to gravitate towards: charisma. Jamie was funny, outgoing, and the kind of kid who could make friends with anyone. One day during recess, X found himself sitting alone at the edge of the playground, scribbling numbers and patterns in the dirt. It was one of his favorite things to do when he needed to think, creating math puzzles in the sand, letting his mind roam free as the equations danced across the ground. "Hey, X. What are you doing?" a voice called out. X looked up to see Jamie standing there, hands on hips, an inquisitive smile on their face. "I'm just making math puzzles," X replied, somewhat shyly, but also intrigued. It wasn't often that someone approached him without a specific agenda. "Math puzzles? That sounds kind of cool, actually. Can I try one?" Jamie asked, sitting down beside him. X hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if Jamie was actually serious or just making fun of him. But then again, it wasn't every day that someone wanted to do math puzzles with him. "Okay," X said, drawing a few quick numbers in the sand. He presented Jamie with a challenge, an equation that involved adding, subtracting, and multiplying numbers, all jumbled together. Jamie stared at the puzzle, their brow furrowing slightly as they tried to work through it. "This is way harder than I thought," Jamie admitted after a moment. "I'm not great at math, but I don't want to give up. Can you help me?" X was taken aback. He wasn't used to being asked for help. Most of the time, he was the one doing the helping. But something about Jamie's openness made him feel comfortable. "Okay, here's how it works," X said, showing Jamie step by step how to solve the puzzle. He explained it slowly, using his usual patience and precision, but this time, something was different. Jamie was listening. They weren't dismissing him or acting like his skills were too much. They were genuinely interested. By the time they finished, Jamie had not only solved the puzzle, but they were grinning. Wow, that was actually really fun. You're good at this, X. Like, really good. X smiled, a sense of pride swelling inside him. It felt good to be appreciated for something other than his weirdness. It felt good to be acknowledged for his mind. Thanks, X replied, his voice a little quieter than usual, but the gratitude was clear in his tone. Over the next few days, Jamie and X spent more time together, working on puzzles and discussing numbers. Jamie didn't always understand everything X showed them, but they were genuinely curious. And X found himself growing more comfortable with their company. He had never thought about making a friend who wasn't exactly like him, but Jamie had shown him that you didn't have to be the same to get along. During lunchtime one day, Jamie turned to X, their expression thoughtful. You know, X, I've been thinking. You've got something special, something that a lot of people don't understand. But I think if you just show it in your own way, people might start to get it. They might start to appreciate it. X looked at Jamie, feeling a mix of surprise and appreciation. He had always thought he needed to hide his abilities, to fit in with the crowd. But now, Jamie was telling him that it was okay to stand out. It was okay to be who he was. You think so? X asked, his voice hesitant but hopeful. Yeah, Jamie replied, grinning. I mean, look at me. I'm not the best at math, but I'm still kind of good at other stuff. And people like me for it. You just have to be yourself. Let people see the cool things you can do, but don't force it. Just, let them come to you. X nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if it would be that easy, but he liked the idea. He liked the idea of being appreciated for who he was, without having to hide or shrink himself. As the days passed, X began to take Jamie's advice to heart. He started sharing his love of math more freely, but he didn't push it on anyone. Instead of showing off his skills, he focused on making it fun. He worked with Jamie and a few other classmates, creating math challenges and puzzles that were engaging but not intimidating. Slowly, X began to find his place within the group. The other kids started to see him not just as the weird math genius, but as a friend, someone they could talk to and learn from. One afternoon, as the bell rang and the students filed out of the classroom, Miss Hayes noticed something that made her heart swell with pride. X was walking alongside Jamie, laughing about something that had happened earlier in the day. It wasn't the first time she had seen them together, but it was the first time she saw X genuinely relaxed, his shoulders not hunched in self-consciousness. She watched them for a moment, and a thought crossed her mind: this was what growth looked like. Not just the academic success, but the emotional development, the courage to connect, to reach out, to be vulnerable with others. And for the first time in a long while, X seemed to believe it too. The days following X's newfound friendship with Jamie felt different. His interactions with his classmates were no longer fraught with tension or self-doubt. For the first time, he wasn't the odd one out. He was part of something. And though he still spent much of his time focused on solving problems or exploring mathematical theories, he now had people to share it with, people who didn't judge him, but instead celebrated his uniqueness. It was during one of the many classroom discussions on a Monday morning that X first realized just how much had changed. Ms. Hayes was introducing a new topic, geometry. It wasn't a subject X had been particularly interested in before, but today was different. The way Ms. Hayes explained the topic made it seem like a challenge, a puzzle to be solved. And for the first time, X felt a flicker of excitement. This wasn't just another lesson. This was something he could conquer. As Ms. Hayes wrote the definition of a triangle on the whiteboard, X's hand shot up eagerly. Yes, X. Ms. Hayes asked, her voice kind and patient, a tone that had become second nature when addressing him. I have an idea, X said, his voice steady, but with a newfound confidence. What if we take the angles of a triangle and use them to create different kinds of shapes, not just triangles? Like, could we combine them with other shapes to create something new? Ms. Hayes paused, intrigued by his suggestion. That's an interesting thought, X. Why don't you share your idea with the class? X stood up, his heart racing as the eyes of the entire classroom turned toward him. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken out in class, but it was the first time he felt like his voice mattered. Taking a deep breath, X started to explain his idea. He spoke about the relationships between the angles and how they could be applied to create more complex shapes. It wasn't a conventional answer, but as he spoke, he could see the interest in his classmates' eyes. They were listening. They were paying attention. When X finished, there was a moment of silence. Ms. Hayes smiled warmly at him. That's a very creative idea, X. In fact, I think we'll try that today. Class, let's all follow X's suggestion and see what we can come up with. The students eagerly dove into the activity, and soon the room was filled with the sound of excited chatter as they combined angles to form unique geometric shapes. Even the students who had once dismissed X's abilities began to see him in a new light, not as the kid who was too smart for his own good, but as a peer who could contribute something valuable. Jamie, sitting beside him, turned with a grin. You really know how to make things interesting, don't you? They said. X smiled back, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. I guess I do, he said softly. For the rest of the lesson, X felt a sense of peace he had never felt before in a classroom. He wasn't just participating, he was leading. And in that moment, he realized that all the things he had been afraid of, the things that had once made him feel out of place, were the very things that made him stand out in the best possible way. He wasn't going to hide anymore. He was going to use his gifts, his talents, and his voice to make a difference. After class, Ms. Hayes pulled X aside. That was incredible, X, she said, her eyes full of pride. You really took the lead today. I think you're starting to see just how much you have to offer. X nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't felt in a long time. I think I am, he said, his voice quieter, but filled with certainty. I'm so proud of you, Ms. Hayes continued. And I know this is just the beginning. You've got a lot to give to this world, X, don't ever forget that. X looked up at her, the gratitude in his eyes clear. Thank you. I won't forget. That afternoon, X found himself walking home with Jamie. They were talking about the lesson, laughing about the silly shapes they had come up with, when X suddenly stopped in his tracks. What's wrong? Jamie asked, noticing his sudden stillness. X stared out at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily by. I've been thinking, he said slowly. About everything, about how things used to be. I was always trying to be like everyone else. But I'm starting to think that maybe I don't have to be like them. Maybe I can just be me. And that's enough. Jamie grinned, their eyes sparkling with understanding. I think you've figured it out, X. You've always been enough. And now you're starting to see it too. X smiled back, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to fit in. He was just being himself. And that was more than enough. The next day, X found himself in a different frame of mind. It wasn't about the challenges anymore. It wasn't about being the smartest or the most talented. It was about being true to himself, to the unique individual he was. He didn't have to explain himself to anyone, and he didn't have to hide his talents. His gifts weren't something to be ashamed of, they were something to be proud of. As he walked into the classroom, his eyes met Ms. Hayes once again. This time, she didn't just see the quiet, withdrawn boy who struggled to fit in. She saw the confident young mind who was ready to face whatever challenges came next. And for the first time, X saw it too. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The following weeks were full of surprises. X's newfound confidence had become more than just a fleeting moment, it had become part of who he was. At school, he wasn't just the quiet genius in the corner. He was now a leader, someone who was willing to stand up when it mattered, whether it was for himself or for someone else. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and X wasn't done with the tests that would truly challenge him. It happened during a regular Tuesday morning, just as Ms. Hayes was preparing for a new lesson in class. The topic was simple enough, basic algebra, but something about the day felt different. The air felt heavier, like something was about to shift. As the students settled into their seats, Ms. Hayes walked to the front of the classroom, her usual smile replaced with a more serious expression. "All right, class," she began, "today we're going to do something a little different. You're going to have a test. A surprise test." A murmur of unease spread through the room. Tests weren't new, but the surprise aspect made the students uneasy. X, however, remained calm. He had always been good with math, and he trusted himself to handle whatever was thrown his way. Ms. Hayes handed out the test papers, and X glanced down at the first question. It was an easy one. A couple of basic equations. He quickly solved it, moving to the next. But as he progressed through the test, the problems grew more complex. He solved the first few without much effort, but soon, the questions began to challenge him in ways he hadn't expected. The problems required more than just basic knowledge, they required creative thinking, something X wasn't used to doing under pressure. His hands started to sweat as he stared at the page, trying to figure out how to approach the next question. He'd never been tested like this before. His mind raced as he thought through possible solutions, but nothing seemed to click. He could feel the pressure building. Every time he looked around, he saw his classmates scribbling down answers confidently. Everyone except for him. His mind was blank. He could feel the weight of the test pressing down on him, making it harder and harder to focus. The room felt suffocating. 5 minutes left, Ms. Hayes announced, her voice cutting through the tension. X's pulse quickened. He had barely made a dent in the test. His confidence, which had seemed so unshakable just weeks before, now felt fragile. He had always prided himself on being smart, on having the answers. But today, the answers were nowhere to be found. Jamie, sitting beside him, glanced over and saw the look on his face. "You okay?" they whispered. X nodded quickly, trying to hide his growing frustration. "Yeah, just. I'm stuck." Jamie gave him an encouraging smile. "You've got this. Just breathe. Don't overthink it." X took a deep breath, trying to center himself. But it wasn't working. The pressure was too much. He glanced around the room again, and his gaze landed on Jake, the same boy who had mocked him for being too smart in the past. Jake was breezing through the test, his confidence almost mocking in comparison to X's internal struggle. X felt the old familiar feeling creeping back, doubt. Was he really as smart as he thought? Was he just a fraud, pretending to have it all together when he couldn't even solve a simple algebra problem under pressure? His mind spiraled, and for a moment, he wanted to give up. But then, he remembered the lesson he had learned a few weeks ago, about standing up for what's right. He had stood up for Ben. He had found his voice. This was no different. If he could stand up for others, then surely he could stand up for himself. He shook his head, clearing his thoughts. He wasn't going to let this test define him. He wasn't going to let the pressure overwhelm him. He took another deep breath and returned to the test, focusing on one question at a time. Slowly but surely, his mind started to clear, and he began to work through the problems with more confidence. With only a few minutes left, X finished the test, feeling a rush of relief. It hadn't been perfect, but he had done his best. And that was enough. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the test, X leaned back in his chair, exhausted but satisfied. He had faced the pressure and come out on the other side. Ms. Hayes collected the tests, and as she passed by X, she paused for a moment. "You did well today, X," she said quietly, her voice full of understanding. "I could see you working through it. Sometimes the hardest challenges are the ones we face within ourselves." X looked up at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice steady. "I guess I just needed to trust myself." Ms. Hayes gave him an encouraging nod. "Exactly. You've got this. Remember, it's not about getting everything right. It's about how you handle the challenges that come your way." X nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying, learning, and growing from every experience, good or bad. As X left class that day, he felt a new sense of resolve. It wasn't just his math skills that defined him. It wasn't just his intelligence. It was his ability to face challenges head-on, to keep pushing forward, even when things seemed impossible. That was what made him truly strong. And in that moment, he knew that no test, no challenge, no obstacle could ever make him doubt his worth again. X's life had always been about numbers, equations, and formulas. He was good at them, no, better than good. He was exceptional. But he had never really thought about how those skills could shape the world around him. His perspective was shifting, slowly but surely. He had been so focused on excelling academically that he hadn't truly explored how his intellect could impact people's lives. But then, something happened that caused him to rethink everything. It all started on a regular afternoon when Ms. Hayes assigned a new project for the class. The task was simple in theory: create a math-based model for a real-world problem. In X's mind, it should have been easy. He could analyze, calculate, and predict with ease. But this project, as simple as it seemed, was different. Ms. Hayes wasn't just testing their ability to crunch numbers, she was testing their creativity, their ability to think beyond the textbook. She was challenging them to apply math in ways they'd never considered before. The class was buzzing with energy as everyone scrambled to come up with ideas. Some students quickly settled on projects they thought would be the easiest, things like predicting sports scores, calculating the trajectory of a falling object, or analyzing financial markets. But X. He didn't want to just repeat the same things he had seen before. He wanted something bigger. He wanted to use math for something that could really make a difference. He stared at the blank page in front of him, feeling the pressure rise once again. It wasn't just about getting it right, it was about making it meaningful. His mind wandered back to the day he had stood up for Ben. He remembered how powerful it felt to do the right thing, to stand up for someone who couldn't defend themselves. What if he could apply that same kind of thinking to math? What if math could be a tool to help people, to solve real-world problems in ways that mattered? An idea began to form. What if he could design a model that helped communities deal with water scarcity? He had read about how many parts of the world struggled with access to clean water, and he remembered a segment on the news about droughts in California. Maybe he could use math to predict and manage water resources, something that would make a tangible impact on people's lives. The more he thought about it, the more excited he became. This wasn't just another school project. This could be something bigger. He could use his skills to make a real-world difference. The next day, X approached Ms. Hayes with his idea. "I was thinking about designing a model to predict and manage water resources," he said, his voice filled with determination. "There's this issue with water scarcity, and I think math could be used to help solve it." Ms. Hayes raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his suggestion. "That's an ambitious project, X. But I like it. You're thinking outside the box. But you'll need to consider variables, climate change, geography, population growth. And you'll have to think about how to make it practical. Can you break it down into smaller, manageable parts?" X nodded, feeling the weight of the challenge, but also the excitement of what lay ahead. "Yeah, I'll start by analyzing data on rainfall, water usage, and how much water is needed for basic survival in different regions. Then, I'll model how to allocate resources more efficiently. Ms. Hayes smiled, her expression one of approval. You're thinking critically. Keep it up. But don't forget, this is a project that requires empathy as much as it requires math. Think about the people who will be affected by your model. This isn't just about numbers. It's about real lives. X nodded again, his mind already racing ahead to the possibilities. As he walked back to his seat, he realized that this project wasn't just about proving his intelligence to others, it was about using his knowledge to help people. And that was a turning point for him. It was the moment he truly understood the power of his abilities. Math wasn't just something to show off in class. It was a tool to change the world. For the next few weeks, X poured himself into the project. He spent hours researching data on water usage, climate patterns, and the geography of water sources. He read about different communities around the world that had struggled with water shortages and droughts. He learned about the technology and methods that had been used to alleviate those issues. But most importantly, he focused on how he could make his model practical, ensuring that it could be used to help communities in need. It was hard work, but X felt more alive than he ever had. This wasn't just about equations anymore. This was about finding solutions. This was about making a difference. Finally, the day came when he was ready to present his project. The classroom was filled with the usual buzz of excitement as the students set up their presentations. When it was X's turn, he stood up with a sense of pride that he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just another presentation. This was his chance to show the world what he could do. He began by explaining the global water crisis and the impact it had on millions of people around the world. As he spoke, he felt the weight of the issue, the responsibility to do something about it. He explained the model he had created, showing how it could help predict water shortages and manage resources more efficiently. As he finished, the room was silent. X could see the impressed looks on his classmates' faces, but he was focused on something else entirely. He was focused on the feeling inside him. The sense of purpose. The realization that this was what he had been searching for. This wasn't just about excelling in school. This was about using his skills to make a difference. And in that moment, X knew that he had found his true calling. X's project had far exceeded anyone's expectations, especially his own. It wasn't just a model for water conservation, it was a glimpse into a future where people like him, people who had the privilege of learning and understanding, could apply their knowledge to tackle real-world problems. The project opened his eyes to something he had never truly considered before: his intellect could change lives. As X walked out of the classroom after presenting his project, he felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Ms. Hayes had been impressed, but more than that, she had been proud. X, you've done something incredible here. Don't let this just be a one-time project. Keep pushing. Keep building on this, she had said with a smile. That encouragement lingered in his mind as he stepped into the hallway, the noise of students and lockers fading as he processed what Ms. Hayes had said. It wasn't just about acing tests or impressing his peers anymore. He had something bigger now, a purpose. But what was he supposed to do with that? It wasn't long before the ripple effect of his project began to take shape. The next day, X's idea started spreading beyond his classroom. A few of his classmates had taken interest in his project and, to his surprise, wanted to collaborate. At first, he was hesitant. After all, he had worked so hard on this alone, and he wasn't sure how it would feel to share something so personal. But the more they asked questions, the more X realized that maybe collaboration wasn't a weakness, it could be a strength. Jake, the student who had once mocked him, was the first to approach. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, as if unsure of how to frame his words. "Hey, X," Jake began, "I think your water model is pretty amazing. I was thinking, maybe we could take it further. I've got some ideas for improving the data analysis part of it." I've been working on a project with some computer models, and I think we could make it even more accurate. X wasn't sure how to respond. This was the same Jake who had openly mocked him in the past. But something about the way Jake spoke now, the sincerity in his voice, made X pause. He nodded slowly, surprised at the offer. "I'd be open to hearing your ideas," he said cautiously. "But it's not just about the math. It's about the people it can help." Jake looked at him with newfound respect. "I get it. I wasn't thinking about that before. But after seeing what you've done, I get it now. I think we could really do something with this." With that, a partnership was born, one that X never saw coming. They worked together, blending their strengths to refine the model, improving its data accuracy, and looking at new ways to predict and manage water shortages. It wasn't just about crunching numbers, it was about creating something that could help communities in need. Word of their project spread, and soon, other students from different classes wanted to join in. Some offered help with the tech side of things, others brought in research on sustainable water practices. What started as a solo project had evolved into a group effort, one that was growing larger than X ever imagined. As the weeks passed, their project gained traction. It wasn't just a school assignment anymore, it had the potential to become something much bigger. Local news outlets began to take an interest, and soon, X was contacted by a non-profit organization that focused on environmental sustainability. They had heard about the project and wanted to know more. Could X's model be applied in real-world scenarios? Could it help communities in need? The idea that had started in the classroom now had the potential to impact the world. X's heart raced with excitement and fear. He wasn't sure what to do with all of this attention, but the possibilities were endless. What if this project could actually make a difference in the world? The nonprofit asked to meet with X and his group. It was surreal. Just a few months ago, X had been just another student in class, blending into the background. Now, he was meeting with experts, talking about water conservation on a global scale. The day of the meeting arrived, and X couldn't help but feel nervous. He had never been in a situation like this before. It felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. But as he walked into the conference room, something inside him clicked. This wasn't just a meeting. This was the beginning of something bigger. He took a deep breath and looked around at his team, Jake, Jamie, Ben, and the others who had helped him get to this point. They were all in this together. This wasn't just about X anymore, it was about all of them. The meeting was intense, with a lot of technical discussions and questions about how to refine their model for real-world applications. But X held his ground, answering questions confidently and offering insights into how the model could be adapted to different regions. As the conversation went on, the representatives from the nonprofit organization seemed more and more impressed. At the end of the meeting, one of the representatives stood up and smiled. "We're excited to see where this goes. We believe your model could help in areas that need it most. We'll be in touch." X's heart raced as they left the meeting. It wasn't a done deal yet, but they had made an impact. This was only the beginning. Back at school, things had changed. X wasn't just a quiet genius anymore. He was a leader, a student who had taken an idea and turned it into something that could potentially change the world. He had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and the ripple effect was spreading farther than he could have ever imagined. But with this newfound success came new challenges. As the project grew, so did the pressure. More eyes were on him, and expectations were higher than ever. There were moments when X wondered if he could handle it all, if he could keep up with the momentum he had created. But deep down, he knew he couldn't stop now. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people who needed help. And X wasn't about to back down from that responsibility. The weeks after the meeting with the nonprofit were a blur for X. What had started as a small project in his high school classroom was now taking on a life of its own. His phone was constantly buzzing with messages, emails, and phone calls from people interested in his model. It felt surreal. X had always been the quiet, intellectual kid who preferred working alone, but now he was at the center of something much bigger. The pressure was mounting. It wasn't just the attention from the nonprofit anymore. There were reporters calling, classmates who wanted to know more, and teachers who had never paid much attention to him before suddenly asking for updates. He found himself giving interviews, speaking to groups, and even attending events about water conservation. The bright lights, the spotlight, it was all so overwhelming. But the thing that truly weighed on him wasn't the attention, it was the expectation. X had always prided himself on being able to control his work. He could always retreat into his world of numbers and equations, where everything made sense and followed clear patterns. But now, things were different. He wasn't just making a model anymore, he was being asked to change the world. And with that responsibility came doubts. What if it doesn't work? What if I fail? He found himself lying awake late at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. What if his model didn't work as well in real-world applications? What if the nonprofit's resources weren't enough to implement it on a large scale? What if people got hurt because he didn't account for the right variables? These thoughts plagued him every day. It wasn't just about making a difference anymore. It was about making the right difference. But through it all, there was one thing that kept him grounded, his team. The people who had believed in him from the beginning. The people who had helped him build this project from the ground up. Jake had come a long way since their first encounter. He wasn't the arrogant student who had mocked X anymore. He had become a vital part of the team, contributing ideas and offering technical expertise. Jamie, who had once been hesitant to even speak to X, had proven to be a fierce ally, particularly in terms of communicating the importance of the project to others. And Ben, who had been X's first real friend in school, was there for moral support, always reminding X of why they had started in the first place. One afternoon, as X sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen with a sense of dread, Jake knocked on his door. "Hey, man," Jake said, peeking inside. "You've been staring at that thing for hours. You need a break." X looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I don't know if I can take a break, Jake. This project, it's bigger than I thought. People are counting on me now. If this doesn't work, it's on me." Jake stepped inside and pulled up a chair. "Listen, I get it. This is huge. But you don't have to carry all of this by yourself. We're in this together. And we're way further along than we ever thought possible." X didn't say anything at first. His mind was racing, and he felt like there was a weight pressing down on him. But as he looked at Jake's sincere expression, something clicked. This wasn't just his burden to bear. It was everyone's. He had a team, a group of people who were just as invested in this project as he was. "You're right," X finally said, his voice soft. I feel like if it doesn't work, I'll let everyone down. You, Ms. Hayes, the people who are counting on this." Jake nodded. "I get it, man. But you've already done something amazing. You've started a conversation, and that's what matters. People are listening, and that's a big deal. You've changed the way people see math. You've turned it into something that can help. And that's what matters most." X smiled faintly, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "Thanks, Jake. I don't know what I'd do without you." Jake shrugged, grinning. "That's what friends are for, right?" As the conversation continued, X felt a renewed sense of clarity. The road ahead would be difficult, but he didn't have to do it alone. He had a team of people who were there to support him, and together, they could overcome whatever challenges lay ahead. The next day, X made a decision. He was going to take a step back and let his team contribute more. He would stop trying to shoulder all of the responsibility himself. After all, it was their project too. Over the following weeks, X delegated more tasks to the team. He allowed Jake to refine the technical side of the model, Jamie to reach out to the media, and Ben to help with outreach and community engagement. They worked together seamlessly, each person bringing their strengths to the table. X realized that the pressure he had felt was self-imposed. He didn't have to do everything on his own. And as the project continued to grow, so did his confidence. With each passing day, the doubt that had once clouded his thoughts began to dissipate. He was still nervous, still unsure of what the future held, but he now knew that he wasn't facing it alone. One evening, as X sat at his desk, reviewing the latest updates from the nonprofit, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Ms. Hayes. "I just wanted to say how proud I am of everything you've accomplished, X. You've really come into your own as a leader. But more importantly, you've shown what true innovation looks like. Keep pushing forward. The world needs people like you." Reading those words, X felt a surge of pride. The weight he had been carrying didn't feel as heavy anymore. It wasn't about proving himself to anyone. It wasn't about living up to anyone's expectations. It was about the impact he could make. And that was enough. X's journey had seemed like an unstoppable force. His project was making waves, his team was stronger than ever, and the world was beginning to pay attention. But just when everything seemed to be falling into place, reality had a way of reminding him that things weren't always as easy as they seemed. It started as a simple issue, a glitch in the data model. At first, it didn't seem like much. A few discrepancies in the results, a couple of data points that didn't line up. But the further they pushed the model, the worse it got. The water conservation algorithms X had developed were producing wildly inaccurate results, and the predictions were nowhere near as reliable as they had been in the early stages of the project. X felt his stomach drop as he stared at the screen, his mind racing to understand what had gone wrong. He was no expert in coding or advanced data modeling, but he had always prided himself on his ability to think logically. This wasn't logical. The data shouldn't have gone off track like this. What happened? Jake asked, looking over his shoulder at the computer screen. The excitement and optimism in his voice from earlier had been replaced by a note of concern. "This wasn't here yesterday. Why is the model failing?" X ran his hands through his hair, frustration boiling inside him. He couldn't answer that. He didn't know. What had started as a brilliant solution now seemed like an insurmountable problem. I don't know. I thought we had it all figured out," X said, the weight of the situation sinking in. "Maybe we rushed too much. Maybe I missed something." "No, man," Jake interrupted, his tone firm. "We all did this together. There's no one person to blame." But X wasn't convinced. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, he had failed. Everything was on the line now. The nonprofit had shown interest, the media was starting to take notice, and now this. It was like the rug had been pulled out from under him. He felt himself spiraling, unable to focus on anything but the mistake that seemed to threaten everything they had worked for. Over the next few days, X isolated himself. He spent countless hours in front of his laptop, poring over every line of code and every variable in the model. The more he searched for an answer, the more confused he became. The solution was elusive, like trying to catch a shadow. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing, replaying every moment that had led to this point, wondering where it had all gone wrong. The stress began to take a toll on him, affecting his ability to think clearly. His friends, his team, they all noticed. Jamie was the first to approach him. "X, you're burning yourself out," Jamie said gently, standing at the door to his room. "You need a break. This isn't like you. We've all got your back. You don't have to solve this alone." X didn't look up. "I have to fix it. I can't let everything fall apart because I missed something." Jamie sighed and sat beside him. "You haven't missed anything. This isn't just about you, X. You're part of a team. We all want this to succeed, and we're going to figure it out. But you need to trust us. X remained silent, his gaze fixed on the screen. The problem seemed too big to solve, and he couldn't stop thinking about the possibility of failure. The next day, he finally agreed to meet with the team. It wasn't easy, but he knew he couldn't keep pushing them away. The longer he isolated himself, the more the doubt grew. He needed to face the problem head-on, together. The team gathered in the library after school. X walked in, his face pale and his shoulders hunched with exhaustion. Everyone could tell he hadn't slept, and the strain of the last few days had worn him down. I don't know what happened, X said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought we were on track, but now, he shook his head. The model is failing. I can't figure out what went wrong. Jake spoke first, his tone calm but serious. Okay, let's break this down. We've been working on this for weeks. If there's a problem, we'll find it. Let's start from the beginning. For the next few hours, the team worked tirelessly. They went through the data again, examined every assumption in the model, and retested the algorithms. Slowly but surely, they began to uncover the root of the problem, a small but critical error in one of the initial calculations. It wasn't a huge mistake, but it had caused a domino effect, making the entire model unreliable. X let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't the catastrophe he had feared, but it was a setback, one that had cost them valuable time. It's fixable, Ben said, a note of relief in his voice. We just need to correct that part of the equation, and we should be good to go. X looked at each of them, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. These were the people who had helped him get this far. They weren't just team members, they were friends who cared about the project and about him. Thanks, guys, X said, his voice shaking slightly. I don't know what I would have done without you. You don't have to do it alone, Jamie said, her voice firm. We've got this. In that moment, X realized something important: failure wasn't the end. It was just part of the journey. And the most important thing was how you responded to it. He had gotten lost in the pressure, in the fear of failure. But now, with his team by his side, he understood that setbacks were just opportunities to learn and grow. That night, X went home and collapsed into bed, feeling a weight lift off his chest. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer felt alone. He knew that, no matter what came next, he had the support and strength of his friends to carry him through. After the team's late-night breakthrough, X felt a new sense of clarity. The weight that had been crushing him for days seemed lighter now that they had identified the flaw in the model. It wasn't fixed yet, but knowing what had caused the issue made the task seem more manageable. Still, there was a lingering feeling of doubt in the back of his mind. Could they pull it off? Was the fix enough to get the model working as it should? As the days passed, X and his team dove back into their work with renewed determination. They tweaked the equations, adjusted the variables, and tested the model again and again. Slowly but surely, the numbers started to line up. The discrepancies began to fade, and X felt the confidence creeping back into his chest. He still had no idea if the model would be a complete success, but for the first time in weeks, he could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The days leading up to the presentation were a blur. There were still so many moving pieces, so many details to finalize. The nonprofit that had shown interest in their project was pushing for a meeting, an official presentation of the model. X felt a rush of excitement mixed with anxiety. This was it. This was the moment that could make or break everything. And then, the unexpected happened. The day before the presentation, the team discovered a small but concerning bug in the final data set. It wasn't something that would invalidate the entire model, but it was enough to cause X to pause. It was the type of bug that could cause the system to behave unpredictably under certain conditions. X stared at the code, his mind racing. Was it possible to fix it in time? Was it even worth presenting the model if it wasn't perfect? His phone buzzed on the table, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Ms. Hayes. "I know you're working hard, X. Just remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. Whatever happens, be proud of how far you've come. You've already made an impact just by starting this journey." X read the message a few times, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He was so focused on making everything flawless that he had forgotten why he started this project in the first place. He wasn't trying to build something perfect, he was trying to create something that could help. And sometimes, the most important thing was showing up and putting in the work. With renewed clarity, X gathered the team for one last meeting before the presentation. They all gathered in the classroom, surrounded by whiteboards filled with calculations and plans. X stood in front of them, his eyes bright but his voice steady. "Look, guys," he began, "we've come a long way. There's still a bug in the data set that we need to fix, but it's not the end of the world. What matters now is that we present what we have. If we wait for perfection, we'll never move forward. We have to show them what we've done, not what we think we could do." Jake nodded, his confidence evident. "I agree. We've got something great here. Let's not lose sight of that." The team rallied around him, offering their support. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about showing up, taking risks, and making an impact. X felt a sense of calm wash over him. They could fix the bug later. For now, they had to trust in their work and in each other. The next day, they stood in front of the non-profit representatives, a mix of nerves and excitement in the air. X's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to take deep breaths. This was his moment. He wasn't just presenting a model, he was presenting his vision for a better future. "Good afternoon," X began, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in his stomach. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. We're here to present a solution to the growing issue of water conservation. Our model is designed to help cities save water in a way that's sustainable and scalable. But before I dive into the details, I just want to take a moment to say that this project wasn't just about math and numbers. It's about making a difference." He went on to explain the key components of the model, how it worked, the science behind it, and the potential it had for impacting communities. As he spoke, he could see the non-profit representatives leaning in, nodding, their attention fixed on him. He wasn't just speaking to them about the model, he was speaking about hope. He was showing them the possibility of a future where this idea could make a real difference. When he finished, there was a brief silence. For a moment, X wasn't sure what to expect. But then one of the representatives, a woman with glasses and a stern but thoughtful expression, stood up and approached him. "This is impressive, X," she said. "You've built something truly innovative here. We see the potential for this model to change how we think about water conservation." X's heart skipped a beat. Was this real? "Of course, there are a few adjustments that need to be made," she continued, "but the core concept is sound. We're interested in moving forward with you." The words hit him like a wave. The project wasn't just an idea anymore, it was real. They were going to help him implement it, help him bring it to life. As the team filed out of the meeting room, X couldn't wipe the smile from his face. They had done it. The bug in the data was still there, but it no longer mattered. They had been seen. They had been heard. The nonprofit's offer was a turning point in X's journey. The feeling of success was intoxicating. He had started from scratch, made it through the toughest hurdles, and now his project had the potential to change the world. But the world, as X quickly learned, wasn't going to make things easy for him. As the days passed after the meeting, X found himself caught between excitement and fear. The offer to move forward with the nonprofit came with a whole new set of expectations. No longer was his project just an experiment, it was a real, tangible effort to solve a critical global issue. And with that came pressure. There were partnerships to form, timelines to meet, and resources to secure. It felt like every new step forward created even more new challenges. The nonprofit wanted X and his team to refine the model further and expand it to larger scales. It wasn't just about individual cities anymore, they were aiming for an entire region, and the impact could be huge. The thought of taking on such a responsibility felt overwhelming, but at the same time, it was exhilarating. This was what they had been working for. This was the moment he had dreamed about when he first started developing his project. But even though the nonprofit was supportive, they weren't going to make it easy. They expected results, and they expected them fast. "All right, team," X said one afternoon as they gathered to review their progress. "We've got this amazing opportunity ahead of us, but there's a lot of work to be done. We're going to have to scale this model up, and fast. It's no longer just about refining the algorithms. We need to expand this so it can handle larger cities. We need more data, more variables to consider." Ben raised an eyebrow. "You think we can do that with the time frame they gave us? They're expecting something by next month. That's pushing it." X nodded, acknowledging the challenge. "I know. But we've done this before. We've already worked through the hardest part, and this is just the next step. If we stay focused, we can get there. It's not going to be easy, but we're in this together." The team began working tirelessly again. The pressure was unlike anything X had experienced before. Every decision felt like it could make or break the project. They needed more data from different cities to test the model on larger scales, and getting that data wasn't as simple as asking for it. They had to collaborate with city planners, environmental groups, and other organizations. Each partnership took time, and the clock was ticking. X was spending late nights at his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his tired face. He could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. If this didn't work, everything would fall apart. Not just for him, but for the people who believed in him, the nonprofit, his team, the communities they were trying to help. One night, X received an email from Ms. Hayes. She had been following the project's progress and wanted to check in. "X, I know things are getting intense right now, but I want you to take a step back and think about why you started this project. You're not just solving a problem, you're making an impact. Don't let the pressure of deadlines make you lose sight of that. You've come so far, and I believe in you. You've got this." X read her message over and over again. Her words had a calming effect on him. He had been so focused on the end result that he had almost forgotten why he started in the first place. It wasn't about meeting deadlines, it was about making a difference. That was the driving force behind everything he had done, and it was what would keep him going through the most difficult days ahead. The next morning, X called a team meeting. "All right, listen up," X said, standing at the front of the room. "We've got a lot of work to do, but we're not going to let the pressure crush us. I know we've got tight deadlines, and I know it feels like we're juggling a million things at once. But we've already come this far, and we can do this. We just need to stay focused, stay organized, and take it one step at a time." The team nodded, a renewed sense of determination in their eyes. They had been through the highs and lows together, and now, they were more committed than ever to making the project a success. Over the next few weeks, the team worked around the clock. X was in constant communication with the nonprofit, providing them with updates and refining the model as much as possible. They had partnered with several cities, gathering more data, and the results were promising. The model was scaling, and the predictions were more accurate than ever. But with every new breakthrough, new obstacles arose. One of the city partnerships fell through at the last minute, and another city's data turned out to be unusable. Every time they hit a roadblock, it felt like the entire project was about to fall apart. Through it all, X learned the importance of flexibility. They couldn't control everything, sometimes, things didn't go according to plan. But that didn't mean they couldn't find another way forward. It wasn't about avoiding failure, it was about adapting to it, learning from it, and finding solutions. One day, after hours of brainstorming and reviewing the data, the team finally hit the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They had managed to refine the model to a point where it was not only scalable but also adaptable to different environmental factors. It was a huge win, and it felt like the weight of the world had lifted off X's shoulders. "All right," X said, feeling a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "We did it. We're ready." It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, and the road was far from easy. But in that moment, X realized that they had made it through the hardest part. They had built something that could change the way the world looked at water conservation. And with that realization, he knew they were on the right path. X sat back in his chair, staring at the screen in front of him. The numbers on the model were finally starting to align. The adjustments, the partnerships, and all the long hours of work were beginning to show results. It was a turning point, a moment that felt like it could lead them to something bigger than they had ever imagined. But there was no time to celebrate. In the midst of their progress, the nonprofit had requested an unexpected meeting. They wanted an update on the model's performance, and more than that, they wanted to know if X and his team were ready to take it to a national scale. The pressure was mounting, but X had a feeling that this meeting would change everything. As X prepared for the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving faster than he had anticipated. The nonprofit was already looking beyond the model's initial success. They wanted a solution that could be applied to cities nationwide. This was the next step in their partnership, and it came with a new set of challenges. The team gathered in their makeshift conference room, their faces a mix of excitement and anxiety. X's mind was racing. This was it, the big moment. If the nonprofit saw their work as viable, the project would explode into something much bigger. But the pressure to deliver felt suffocating. Could they really scale the model fast enough? Was it even possible to make it work on a national level? Before the meeting, X sent a quick message to Ms. Hayes. "I don't know if we're ready for this. What if we're not prepared for what's coming? I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, and now they want us to go big." Ms. Hayes responded almost immediately. "X, you've already proven that you can handle more than you thought possible. This is a huge opportunity, but the only way to succeed is to take the leap. Don't second-guess yourself now. You've got the talent, and you've got the team. Believe in what you've built." X exhaled slowly. Ms. Hayes's words were always a reminder that it wasn't about perfection, it was about taking risks and believing in the work they had already done. It was time to take that leap. The nonprofit's representatives arrived in the meeting room, their expressions serious but hopeful. The stakes were higher than ever, and X could feel the weight of it on his shoulders. "Good afternoon," X began, trying to steady his nerves. "We're excited to present the latest iteration of the model. We've made significant progress, and we're ready to show you how it can scale to larger cities." He began explaining the latest updates, the refinements they had made, the partnerships they had formed, and the promising results they were seeing in smaller pilot cities. As he spoke, he could see the representatives nodding, their eyes focused on the screen, but he couldn't tell if it was the right kind of attention. Was it the interest they needed to move forward? "We believe the model is ready for larger cities," X continued, "and we've worked hard to ensure that it can be adaptable. But we understand the importance of accuracy, especially when scaling. There are still risks involved, and we want to make sure we address those risks before moving forward." He paused, feeling the tension in the room rise. The nonprofit representatives exchanged glances. X's heart pounded in his chest. Had he said too much? Were they doubting the project? Finally, one of the representatives spoke. "You've made impressive progress, X. But we need to ask, are you sure the model can be scaled to a national level in the time frame we're working with? This is a huge undertaking, and we need to be certain that it can handle the complexities of larger cities." X's mind raced. Could they? Was he sure? We've taken every possible step to ensure that the model can handle increased complexity, X said, trying to keep his voice steady. But I want to be upfront, we're not done yet. There are still challenges to overcome, and the road ahead is uncertain. However, I believe that with the right support and collaboration, we can make it happen. The representatives looked at each other again. Then, the same woman who had spoken earlier looked back at X. You've certainly come a long way, she said, her voice softening. But we need to be realistic about the timeline. We're talking about something that could affect millions of people. If we move forward, we need to make sure we're not rushing things. We can't afford to make mistakes. X felt a knot in his stomach. They were right, of course. This was a massive responsibility, and there was no room for error. But he had worked too hard to back down now. I understand the stakes, X said, standing a little straighter. And I'm not asking for a rushed timeline. What I'm asking for is a chance to prove that this model can work. We've already shown that it can succeed on a smaller scale. With more resources and more data, I believe we can build something that can change the way cities approach water conservation. There was a long pause before the representatives spoke again. Finally, the woman who had been the most vocal spoke up. We believe in your potential, X. We're willing to give you the resources to take this to the next level. But we need to set a clear deadline and ensure that you're fully committed. This isn't a small project anymore, it's a national effort. X felt his heart race. This was it. The tipping point. Thank you, X said, his voice filled with gratitude. We won't let you down. We're ready. As the meeting ended and the representatives left, X stood in the room, his mind still racing. The project was now bigger than he had ever imagined. But with that growth came even greater responsibility. They weren't just working for the people they had helped so far, they were now working for the entire nation. The road ahead was uncertain, and the pressure was only going to increase. But X knew one thing for sure, there was no turning back now. The days following the nonprofit's green light felt like a blur. X had never experienced anything quite like the weight of responsibility he now carried. What had started as a small, passion-driven project had grown into a massive, nationwide effort. There were deadlines to meet, people to manage, and expectations to satisfy. It was all happening so fast. X's team had expanded rapidly. With the new backing, they could hire specialists, engineers, data scientists, city planners, all the people they needed to make the project scalable. But with more people came more complexity. X found himself in constant meetings, balancing between technical briefings and strategic discussions. Every day, there were more decisions to make, more people to communicate with, more obstacles to overcome. The pressure was relentless. His phone buzzed with updates every few minutes, emails flooded his inbox, and the Slack channel was constantly pinging with notifications. The nonprofit was breathing down their necks, asking for progress reports and offering feedback. The urgency was palpable. Time was slipping away, and every second felt like a battle to stay on top of everything. Late one night, as X sat in his office, the quiet hum of his laptop was the only sound filling the room. The team had left hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to go home. His mind was consumed with numbers, deadlines, and strategies. He stared at the data they had collected over the last few weeks, but something felt off. Despite the success of the smaller city models, something wasn't aligning. Was it the way they had scaled? Were they missing something crucial? X opened his notebook, scribbling notes as he tried to work through the problem. But the deeper he dug, the more questions he found. There was no perfect solution, only compromises. They were facing a massive challenge in making the model applicable to cities of all sizes, climates, and infrastructures. And the clock was ticking. As the hours passed, X began to feel the familiar sting of exhaustion creeping in. His eyes were sore, his mind was foggy, but there was no stopping. They had come too far to give up now. He knew the importance of this project, not just for the non-profit, but for the future of water conservation across the country. They were trying to fix a problem that had been ignored for too long. And that kept him going. But just as he was about to dive back into the data, there was a knock at the door. It was Ben, holding a coffee cup. "Thought you could use this," Ben said with a weary smile. "Also, we need to talk." X looked up, a bit startled. Ben had been one of his closest allies through this journey, and he could see the concern in his friend's eyes. Ben had always been the level-headed one in the group, and if something was off, he was the first to notice. "Everything okay?" X asked, taking the coffee and gesturing for Ben to sit. Ben hesitated before speaking. "I think you're burning out, man. You've been pushing yourself too hard. You're trying to manage every little detail, and I get it, it's important. But you're not alone in this. We're all here to help." X let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have a choice. If I don't stay on top of everything, it'll all fall apart. The non-profit is expecting results, and I can't let them down. Not now." "I get it," Ben said, nodding. "But you've got a team for a reason. We're in this together. You don't have to carry it all on your shoulders. Trust us, we've got your back." X paused, looking at Ben. His friend was right. The team had come so far together. He couldn't keep pushing himself into the ground. If he was going to lead them to success, he needed to trust the people around him. He couldn't do it alone. "Thanks, Ben," X said, his voice softer than before. "I know I've been overworking myself. I'll try to ease up a bit." Ben smiled and patted him on the back. "Good. We're in this for the long haul. Don't forget that." As Ben left the room, X felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. For the first time in weeks, X allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. Maybe he didn't have to handle everything himself. Maybe, just maybe, he could rely on his team. And that was the kind of leadership that could bring them all the way to the finish line. The next day, X called a team meeting. The room was filled with the familiar hum of activity, but this time, the mood was different. There was a shared sense of purpose in the air. They had all been working long hours, but X knew that it was time for a new approach. "All right, everyone," X said as he stood at the front of the room. "We've been pushing hard for weeks, and I know it's been overwhelming. But I want to remind you why we're doing this. We're not just solving a problem. We're changing the way cities think about water conservation. This is bigger than any one of us, and it's going to take all of us working together." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "From now on, we're going to work smarter, not harder. We're going to delegate more, collaborate more, and make sure that everyone has a chance to contribute. No one here is in this alone. We've got a team that's built to tackle this, so let's use that strength." The team nodded, and there was a renewed sense of energy in the room. For the first time in weeks, X felt like they were ready for what came next. He wasn't going to carry the burden alone anymore. They were all in this together, and that was what was going to make them successful. As they dove back into their work, X felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him for weeks. The pressure was still there, but it didn't feel as crushing. With his team at his side, he knew they could tackle the challenges ahead. And he was ready to face them. The sun was setting over the city as X stood at the edge of the rooftop, looking out over the skyline. The team had finally reached the final stage of the project, the moment they had worked for, day in and day out. What started as an idea, a passion project, had now grown into something monumental. There was still so much to be done, but they were on the cusp of seeing their hard work pay off. Behind him, the office buzzed with activity. Laptops were open, papers scattered across desks, and the sound of keyboards clicking filled the room. But it was different this time. The tension had shifted from anxiety to anticipation. The final push was happening now, and everyone was ready. X's phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Hayes. "You've come so far. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. It's just beginning. Whatever happens, you've made a difference. Be proud of what you've built." X smiled at her words, his heart swelling with gratitude. She had always been there, encouraging him when the road seemed impossibly long. Her belief in him had given him the strength to keep going. "X. We're ready." Ben's voice pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see his friend standing in the doorway, a look of excitement in his eyes. X nodded, a feeling of calm settling over him. The team had made it to this point together, and they were ready to face whatever challenge came next. It had been a long, tough road to get here, but X knew that they had done something incredible. The model had been refined, tested, and improved. The pilot programs in several cities had exceeded expectations, and now the time had come to roll it out on a national level. He walked back into the office and joined the team at the center of the room. They were gathered around a large screen displaying the final version of the model. The numbers, the algorithms, the simulations, all of it was ready to go. The last details had been ironed out. This was it. "All right, everyone," X said, standing at the head of the room. "This is the moment we've been waiting for. Let's make it count. We've worked hard, we've fought through every obstacle, and now we're ready to change the game. Let's show them what we've built." The room erupted into applause. X couldn't help but smile. He had always believed in the power of his team, but seeing them come together like this, seeing them all invested in the mission, filled him with pride. This was more than just a project, it was a movement, a chance to leave a lasting impact on the world. X took a deep breath and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each team member. They were more than colleagues, they were a family. And together, they had built something that could change the course of history. "We've come this far," X continued. "But it doesn't stop here. We have a responsibility to keep pushing, to keep innovating, and to keep improving. We've laid the foundation, but now we have to build on it. The road ahead will still be full of challenges, but I know that we're ready for them." The room was filled with a sense of unity, a feeling that they were all in this together. The challenges they had faced over the past few months had brought them closer, and now, they were ready to take on whatever came next. X felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. He knew that the next steps would be crucial. They had to maintain their momentum, keep refining the model, and make sure that the implementation went smoothly. But this time, he felt more confident than ever. As the team began to finalize the presentation for the nonprofit, X took a moment to reflect. It had been a long, hard journey, full of setbacks, doubts, and moments of uncertainty. But it had also been filled with triumphs, breakthroughs, and moments of pure joy. And through it all, he had learned something important, that success was never about doing everything yourself. It was about trusting the people around you, believing in your vision, and pushing forward, no matter the obstacles. The nonprofit's representatives were scheduled to arrive the next day to see the final presentation. This was the moment they had all been working for. But in that moment, X didn't feel the usual pressure. Instead, he felt a sense of peace. They had done their best, and no matter what happened, they had already accomplished something incredible. The team worked late into the night, preparing the final details of their presentation. The tension was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't fear, it was excitement. The excitement of knowing they had created something that could change the world. The excitement of knowing that they had pushed the limits of what was possible. By morning, everything was ready. The nonprofit representatives arrived on time, and the meeting began. X and his team presented their model, everything they had worked for, everything they had believed in, all came down to this moment. There were no surprises this time. The nonprofit had seen their progress, and they were impressed. "We're ready," one of the representatives said as the meeting wrapped up. "This is the future of water conservation. We're moving forward with the national rollout." X's heart soared. It was official. They had done it. As the representatives left the room, X turned to his team. They exchanged smiles, hugs, and high fives. They had made it. Against all odds, they had succeeded. "We did it," X said, his voice filled with emotion. "This is just the beginning." He looked out the window, watching as the sun rose higher in the sky. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, X felt confident. They had created something that could change the world. And no matter what happened next, it was a victory they would always remember. As the team celebrated their success, X took a moment to reflect on the journey. He had started this project with nothing but a vision, and now it was a reality. They had built something powerful, something that would leave a lasting legacy. And with that thought, he knew, this was only the beginning of something much, much bigger. Months had passed since the national rollout. The team had successfully implemented their water conservation model across various cities, and the results were even better than anticipated. X could hardly believe how quickly things had snowballed from a small pilot project to a nationwide movement. But as with any great success, the question lingered, what's next? X sat in his office late one evening, staring at the screen of his laptop. The numbers were good, the implementation smooth, but there was something he couldn't shake. The feedback was pouring in from cities everywhere, and while many were thrilled with the impact, a small part of him knew they could push the boundaries even further. There were more cities to reach, more issues to tackle, more lives to touch. Ben's voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, man, we need to talk." X looked up to see Ben standing at the doorway, holding a cup of coffee. X smiled, his thoughts momentarily distracted by the sight of his friend, someone who had been through every step of this journey with him. "What's up?" X asked. "I've been thinking," Ben began, sitting down across from him. "The impact has been incredible, no doubt about it. But we're still only scratching the surface. We've helped large cities, but there are so many smaller towns, rural areas, even communities on the brink of collapse that need our help. And it's not just about water conservation anymore. It's about access, sustainability, education, changing entire systems." X leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. We've made huge strides, but it's not enough. There's a bigger picture here." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. X had always dreamed big, but hearing Ben put it into words felt like a call to action. The project had already grown beyond their expectations, but was it truly fulfilling its potential? "Maybe it's time to take things to the next level," X said, his voice tinged with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "We've been talking about water conservation, but what if we expanded the model? What if we created a comprehensive approach that included sustainable infrastructure, waste management, renewable energy, and education on all of it?" Ben raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Are you saying we take the framework we've built and turn it into something even bigger, something that addresses environmental issues from multiple angles?" X nodded. "Exactly. Right now, we're making sure cities save water. But why stop there? What if we could help them build entire ecosystems that are self-sustaining? What if we help them rethink waste, energy, food, and water all at once?" The idea hung in the air between them, and X felt the excitement build within him. It was ambitious, it was risky, and it could stretch their resources thinner than ever before. But something about it felt right. The project had been successful because they had taken a holistic approach to water conservation. Why not extend that same mindset to the bigger environmental picture? "Can we pull it off?" Ben asked, clearly pondering the massive undertaking. "We'll need more resources, more partners, and probably a lot of people to buy into the vision. But we've already proven we can make an impact. We have the data, the technology, the partnerships. And we have a team that's committed. Ben looked thoughtful. It won't be easy. But it feels like the logical next step. We've gotten this far, why not push ourselves even further? X stood up, pacing around the room as the idea took root in his mind. This could change everything. A project that not only addressed water issues but transformed entire cities, turning them into sustainable, self-sufficient systems. The scope was enormous, but the potential was limitless. Ben, we've got to start thinking bigger. It's time to build the future, not just solve today's problems. Ben stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights below. All right, let's do it. Let's take the next step. The decision was made. The ripple effect was about to begin. In the weeks that followed, X and Ben began mapping out their new vision. They gathered the team together for a brainstorming session, presenting the idea of expanding the project into a more comprehensive sustainability initiative. The team was initially shocked by the sheer scale of the ambition but quickly embraced the challenge. Ideas flowed, excitement grew, and a new sense of purpose took hold. But as always, there were obstacles. The budget would need to be significantly increased. They would need to secure new partnerships with other environmental organizations, governments, and tech companies. There was also the challenge of maintaining the quality and integrity of their original water conservation project while expanding their scope to include new areas like waste management, renewable energy, and food sustainability. X found himself leaning heavily on his team more than ever before. He trusted them with the heavy lifting, delegating tasks, organizing meetings, securing funding, and reaching out to potential partners. It felt like they were in the beginning stages again, just as uncertain as when they first started, but with one key difference: they had experience, credibility, and a proven model. It wasn't long before the nonprofit that had funded the Water Conservation Initiative began taking interest in their new vision. The team pitched the idea, outlining the potential long-term benefits and the far-reaching impact it could have on the planet. There was hesitation at first. It was a big leap, and many of the nonprofit's partners were reluctant to invest in such a large, multifaceted project. But X's team was passionate, and their commitment to the cause was undeniable. Slowly, the nonprofit began to see the potential, both in terms of environmental impact and the social good it could create. Eventually, they came on board, agreeing to fund the next phase of the project. With the new resources in place, the team set their sights on a larger goal. They would begin in one of the most vulnerable regions, a sprawling city struggling with water shortages, waste management issues, and an unreliable power grid. It would serve as a pilot for their new approach, an interconnected, self-sustaining city. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, the project entered its next phase. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?